November 17th, 2020. It is 7:30 p.m. and I would like to call this regular meeting of the Board of Finance to order. So following the election, our first order of business is to entertain motions for the election of officers. So I'd like to start. We need a motion to nominate someone to be chairman. Jim.
I'd like to make a motion to nominate Mrs. Gronsky as chair.
Second.
Okay, we have a second. Okay. Comments, criticisms, running from the room? My God, no more? Okay. All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, Rob?
Wake up.
Hello, Rob?
Favor.
All right, I shall,
Yep, favor.
all right, I shall abstain from that. Thank you for your confidence in me, I do appreciate it, and will once again try to do my best in this capacity. Second up is I would like to entertain a motion for Vice Chairman of the Board of Finance. Francis.
Yes, I'd like to nominate Jim Palin.
Okay.
Just note that he exceeds, and by reference to recent history, far exceeds both the deserve criteria and the skill criteria. He's worked really hard for this board and in a smart way, and he brings, these professional as well as personal attributes to the task. I think, kind of looking ahead, I see this as good for the board and me personally. So, and I think there's value in some turnover, and so I nominate Jim.
Okay, can I get a second, please? Taylor or Paul? I'll split that. I just wanted to say I echo everything that Frank has said. Jim has been a tremendous asset to this board. He's smart, not nearly as good looking as I am, of course, but I just look at the contributions he's had both to the board itself, but also in technical areas that are in his professional area of expertise, and it is second to none. Actually been very valuable for the board. But I also wanted to offer a few words about Frank and his tenure as vice chairman. I cannot tell you how many times Frank has added interesting questions, has made interesting observations, has been available for things going on during the day when I couldn't be here, has sat in this role to chair meetings when I could not be here myself. His work has been absolutely invaluable, both to the board and to the town, and frankly, selfishly to me. I consider him a great board colleague. I look forward to remaining a friend of his for many years to come. He's just a tremendous board and town citizen, so I just wanted to acknowledge that and say thank you, Frank. Okay, we need a vote for vice chairman. All in favor? Okay. Rob, you good with that?
Good with it.
Jim is vice chairman. Okay, take that as a yes, and Jim's abstaining.
Thank you for
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, and then finally, we need a nomination for secretary to the board. I will actually make that nomination myself, which is I'd like to renominate Dan to be our board secretary. That was my first officer position 5,000 years ago, and it's actually a very interesting job and not one of these thankless jobs when you put the type of energy into it that Dan has done over the last year, which is to pay attention to details. And one of the great things about Dan is that he takes that very seriously. In addition, I think he's learned a lot by doing that. And you can see the results of his work, both mainly in terms of the quality of the board minutes that we have, but just in terms of his contributions to the board by having sorted through these details. Plus he helps work with and manage the team that takes notes for our meetings, and has just done an excellent job with that. And I know you agreed to take on this task again, but I'm just really grateful for not just you continuing in that capacity, but frankly for the work that you've done to date. And I just want to thank you for that. It's really terrific. So I will nominate Dan for that. May I get a second? Taylor. Any other comments? All in favor? Okay. Rob, you're good with that?
Good with it.
Okay, good. All right, 601. Thank you very much. I think we've got our officers set for this year. And thanks to everyone for being part of this board and for all the work that you do. And let's make it another great year. Okay. We've got a few transfers up. Jennifer?
First one is for Norotan Heights Fire Department. They have a project to replace their bay doors. It was approved in the fiscal '20 budget for $41,000. They have sent it out to bid. They received back 2 bids. And based on the bids, they are requesting a transfer of $10,160. The lower bid didn't meet their requirements. They tried to work with them and make the bid work for them, but it didn't. And so they would like to be able to go with the second bidder, which was higher, but they need this transfer in order to do the project. And Sean is here in case you have any questions for him.
Sorry,
So Sean, before we turn this down, any last words?
sorry, I had another meeting.
That's right. No, it sounds like the lower bidder was not just inadequate to start with, but you couldn't make them adequate. I mean, they simply couldn't meet the specifications, is that right?
Correct, we even went back and asked him again to look at the quote and see, and he just didn't, he came back with some answers, but nothing to what we were happy with.
Okay. And in terms of quality of work and being able to meet your specifications, will these guys be able to deliver the doors in the time frame that you require?
At this point, we're just looking to get it done whenever we can.
Okay.
The doors are at least an 8-week lead time.
Okay,
So, and it's the doors we're looking at are basically exactly similar to Norotan Firehouse. So
Okay.
matching the same kind of door style or door spec and door build.
okay.
So, and we know the company and they're very reputable and all that.
Okay, terrific. Any questions for Sean or Jennifer on this? Okay, motion to approve. Paul, second. Jim? All in favor? Aye. Rob, you're okay with this transfer? Okay, 7-0. Okay, thank you, Sean, appreciate that. Your 15 seconds of fame are up, so
It's fine. Sorry, we had another
That's-
firehouse
no.
meeting.
it's no trouble at all. Okay, next up is Police Department, a serious building access problem. Chief, thanks for coming this evening, we appreciate it.
Good evening. I'm returning to the hot seat like Groundhog Day. I was here 22 hours ago sitting in this seat on this very topic. And I've come before the Board of Finance before with issues in the police department building. I think everyone's well aware, 9 years ago, 10 years ago, we got a serious, significant renovation, $18 million. And we came in $1 million under budget. I was not involved with the building project at all. At that point, I was a lieutenant running a patrol squad. So I guess that's a little bit of plausible deniability. But now here, 9, 10 years down the road, we're seeing the seams in the garment starting to show a little bit. This board is aware that we have plumbing issues. We've had issues where we had to have major HVAC replacement. Now it's our building access system, which we've kind of been limping along for 2 years, but it's come to the point where now it's really problematic. Most people will tell you if you're going to uncover problems in the police department, it comes in 2 places. Involuntary guest housing or evidence, and we have issues with both. We have been locked out, and we've had officers locked in our processing area where they cannot get out until another officer comes and lets them out. Very problematic. Right now, our evidence storage room, where all our highly secure evidence is stored, it's only accessible to the property records clerk, chief of police, and I think the administrative services captain. Well, right now, there's only 1 employee that can get into that evidence room, and it's not the chief of police. So that is a problem. And we cannot reboot the system to get it to work. The system that we have in there is an ISONA system. It's long sunsetted. It's a proprietary system. It's, like I said, 2 or 3 years we've been limping along. To get a new system in there from a company called Phoenix, which is a non-proprietary open source system, we asked for, in the fiscal '20 budget, for $78,000 for a replacement. I think that's 48 readers, and including readers in the cell block area. Just before I forget on that, when you go check on an involuntary guest in the back of our building, there's 5 readers there that timestamp that you were actually there. And we're required to do that on a regular basis on shifts to ensure the safety of people that are in our custody. So if I go back there and swipe, it's gonna say that Don Anderson was there checking on Jim Palin at 7:48 PM, right? So there's a lot of aspects of this that we have to do simply to maintain our accreditation status, but even more so, just for the safety and security of the public safety building. I'm not sure exactly what happened, and Jen doesn't exactly know, and I think Kate exactly knows. I prepared the document for then Chief Ray Osborne at $78,000 and change. In that budget, $55,000 was approved. I just cannot tell you what happened there. Although when I was the administrative services captain, I was involved in most budget discussions for the police department, I was not involved in all of them. So what the original request was and what was funded was two different figures. That brings me to where I'm here tonight. The police department's requesting for $33,000 and some change to supplement the original capital request to get this done, soup to nuts, and get us back to where we should be. This is not, unfortunately, it's not a Corvette, it's not a widescreen TV, it's like replacing your boiler. You're just still gonna have the same heat that you had before, but it's gonna work properly, and you're not gonna have to be asking the fire department to come let the chief of police back into his building as to what happened at one point. We could not get into our own building.
Not good. Jennifer, is the $58,000, was that appropriated and stuck into a reserve account, so the funds are there, or what?
The funds are there, it's in a building access project account within the reserve for capital non-recurring, so it's available to them. They
Appropriated and
just need to
sitting there
sign
ready to
it.
go. Okay, so this is just to top that up to get
Yep.
that.
And that was appropriated last year, fiscal '20?
Okay. Questions for the chief?
Is there any type of warranty on the system, given the problems you've had with the existing system?
Yeah, I think the hardware here in the readers is either 2 or 3 years. And in this budget request to bring this up to the $91,000, that includes 3 years of the cloud hosting. This is a cloud hosted system, not a server like we have now. When we got this ISONA system, when we found out the software support we were getting was calling Colorado, it was phone support. There was no tech coming to immediately solve the problem. New England Traffic Solutions, who gave us this bid, we looked far and wide for vendors to do our due diligence, to get the best bang for our buck. New England Traffic Solutions has the state bid. They've been vetted for building access. They're a Glastonbury-based company. My administrative lieutenant, who really ran with the ball with this whole project, is impressed with their responsiveness, and we believe the service that we're going to get from them.
Terrific. Okay, other questions for the chief? Yeah,
One other thing with New England Traffic, if we get the money appropriated here and we go with this company, they're ready to hit the ground running within the next 30 days to start, the
Well, that's
installation.
terrific. They could have it up by the first of the year conceivably, or, by February 1st, surely. Okay. All right, well, to your point, the building's had problems and we've just had to address them, and this sounds as important as any of the problems that we've got to deal with, so I'm certainly supportive of this. If there are no other questions for the chief, motion to approve. Paul, second. Dan? Okay, all in favor? Okay, 6 on our end. Rob, are you okay with this?
Approved, yeah, good with it.
All right, thank you. Chief, thank you very much. Appreciate
Thank you,
you.
folks. Thanks for getting me out early.
No problem.
Thanks.
Okay, next up, some program expenditures for some disinfection equipment.
So the first one for $15,750 comes from the Emergency Management Director. What we have found is with the uptick in COVID cases, we have had to sanitize emergency service vehicles more frequently. Particularly, it's been the police department. They can go to the local car wash for a full sanitizing service, but it has to be scheduled. They can't just drive up, have it done. So it's resulting in a lot of downtime for the vehicles, which is causing a problem for operations. So the police department researched and the emergency management director supports the purchase of a sanitizing system, which can be used to fog a vehicle. They can use it for police vehicles, it can be used for EMS vehicles, fire trucks. We would do it ourselves, much less downtime, and the vehicles will be sanitized. So he is requesting $15,750 to buy the unit and a supply of cleaner. Also, this probably would not be eligible for FEMA, but it may be eligible for other CARES funding reimbursement. So we'll pursue that.
Questions for Jennifer?
Are there savings?
Not necessarily, it's about $150 to sanitize a police car. So we'd have to sanitize an awful lot of cars to make it a savings dollar-wise, but the savings comes in reduced downtime for the vehicles.
Are they just gonna put this at DPW and have people drive through there?
That's my belief, yeah, and then someone will get trained in how to properly use the fog, wear proper PPE, take all those precautions.
So we can use it for police vehicles, fire vehicles?
EMS, it can be used for any vehicle that needs to be sanitized. It doesn't have to be,
What about our school buses? Are we paying them?
I don't know, but, you know, as a vehicle needs to be sanitized, they can go through and use it.
This seems like a reasonable precaution to me. There are no other questions. Motion to approve. Okay, Dan, second. Taylor? Okay, all in favor? Okay, 6 votes. Rob, you okay with this?
Good.
Okay. All right, next up is a appropriation for a tent, it looks like, but you said we don't need that, is that correct?
Right, we can withdraw this request as the tent is no longer needed.
Okay, terrific. We will take that off the list. And then finally, it looks like some tuition reimbursement.
Right, we do have a tuition reimbursement program in the union contracts, and we also offer it for non-represented employees with similar reimbursement criteria. We haven't usually had people take advantage of it, but in the fall, we have had 2 people put in a request for tuition reimbursement to pursue master's degrees. They meet the criteria, they've been approved for it by the HR director and town administrator, and because we don't usually have anybody using it, we didn't put any money in the budget for it, so now we're requesting a transfer from contingency. And then as these 2 continue to pursue their degrees, you'll see the budget request will include funds for them to complete their degrees.
Okay, good for them, professional development, and it's a provision that's offered. Go ahead, Dan.
Are the degrees relevant to their,
Yes, that's one of the criteria in order to be approved for the program.
And do all of the union contracts allow for some type of tuition reimbursement?
Yeah, yes, I'm trying to remember if Public Works does, I'm sure it does, it's just not popping into my mind, but it is available basically to all employees.
Okay, if no other questions, motion to approve. Okay. Jim, second. Paul, all in favor? Okay, Rob, you're okay with this?
Good.
Okay. All right, that's all of our transfers. Next up is a discussion of all the work that's been done on our reserve review process, and the committee has a report which they sent around in advance. And Jim?
Okay, well, I'll look to Dan and Taylor who worked with me to jump in here, but if you all have the presentation in front of you. What I would just say is, just remind everybody what our sort of objectives were looking at the town reserves. The idea was that when we looked around, this past budget cycle, we looked at all the multiple capital reserves that existed at the police department, the 3 different fire departments, the public works, and the parks and rec. We saw sort of a lot of continued annual contributions to these reserves, generally kind of small to medium contributions, but that built up over time. And sometimes those reserves were being used to fund many small things, and sometimes they were being used to fund larger things that might otherwise have kind of come through the program. And so one of the objectives was to just reduce the number of small reserves that we needed to track across the town. The second objective was to just try to look at reducing potentially duplicative reserves so that we just had less money on our balance sheet, less restricted funds sitting in reserves and either return them to the our reserve fund for capital non-recurring expenses or back to the general fund. And then the idea was to, when we came up with this new policy or objective or approach to use these reserves, was to implement it in a consistent way across like Public Works, Parks and Rec, the fire departments and so forth, so that we had consistency in our annual kind of budgeting for capital. Currently, there's 14 different reserves across these 6 departments. Again, the 3 fire departments, the police department, Public Works, and Parks and Rec. You know, those reserves, which are for what I would call and what we'll describe in this presentation as large capital projects and small capital projects, total about 2.4 million. And I would note about 1.7 of that are for the fire apparatus. So when we talk about some of these major capital projects, you'll see us using the fire apparatus as an example. You know, the major capital that we're going to talk about, which include, I should say the reserves that we're going to talk about include major capital and operating expenditures. It was primarily focused on Public Works for some of their larger equipment, the fire departments for their fire apparatus, and for the assessor's office for what is a once every 5-year sort of revaluation. The minor capital projects, which we'll get into, those were scattered, you know, the 14 different accounts were scattered all across the departments. You know, during our analysis, we kind of thought about how do we actually approach capital in the town here. There are 3 different ways that we actually fund these capital expenditures. One is through our annual appropriation, where we're appropriating, in addition to the 2 operating budgets, a capital budget, which includes you know, small, medium, and large capital items that we choose to actually pay for, and whether we're paying for those with newly taxed dollars in the upcoming fiscal year, or whether we're paying for those with previously taxed dollars that we have in our in either our capital reserve fund or in the general fund, but it's generally an appropriation process. The second way that we fund these capital expenditures, and I'll use the fire trucks as an example, is if we look to replace a truck every 10 years, we're funding 1/10 of it every year, approximately for 10 years. And when the expenditure comes up, we have 10 years worth of appropriated funds in a reserve that would match the equipment cost. Both of those appropriations that we just spoke about, you know, go through the Board of Finance and go through the RTM. The third one is bonding. And for the larger capital projects, typically that have not included fire apparatus or large equipment at Public Works, we wait till they pop up and then we bond them over generally the useful life, which is anywhere from 10 to 20 years. So that is the 3 ways that we fund capital. Our working group focused on the middle one, which is reserving ahead of time for these capital projects. Dan or Taylor, anything?
No, which is not to, just one comment, which is not to preclude us from subsequently focusing on bonding and when it is appropriate to bond or not. That could be further work that this committee does.
And just to be clear, all these reserves are actually appropriated, right? So the question would be is, just did you come across anything to suggest a change or a modification in the governance of how those reserve funds are expended, right? Or is it really just up to the department that has control over that reserve to simply decide when they're going to spend it?
I think Jim will get into it, but we do envision a little more control on the board with the requesting access to the board than the
So we broke capital expenditures and major capital and major operating expenditures up into 3 groups. The large ones, which are capital expenditures that are over $100,000 and have a useful life of more than 5 years. Or if it's an operating expenditure, I'll use the example of the revaluation where it's $200,000 to $300,000 that we need to spend every 5 years to appraise all the properties and go through that process. Those are what we're considering major capital or major operating expenditures. And like the threshold, as I pointed out, for capitals, it needs to cost more than $100,000. The useful life needs to be more than 5 years. And in the case of a major operating expenditures, it needs to repeat no more frequently than every 5 years. So if something happens every year, or every 2 years, or every 3 years, that would not qualify for the type of reserve policy that we're gonna outline here. The only real operating expenditure that we can think about now is the revaluation. So, on page 4 here, this is the policy that I guess that our group is recommending to the board to handle the major capital and the major operating expenditures. First is, these expenditures, or anticipated expenditures, I would say, would be funded over a straight line basis. So in the case of the revaluation, we would fund 1/5 of it over each of the 5 years, and then would be available in the 5th year. In the case of for example, the fire truck, if the estimate is that the fire department expects the replacement cost to be X, for it to be $500,000, 10 years from now, then we would fund $50,000 per year, each year. So straight line basis based on, the department's anticipated cost. The second point on the policy going forward is that each year, as part of the budget process, that department, whether it be the police department, Parks and Rec, the fire department, would reevaluate each of these items. So to the extent they thought that the purchase was being pushed out a year, or being accelerated a year, or that the anticipated cost went from, for example, $500,000 to $550,000 or down to $450,000, they would then recalibrate the reserve, and we would calculate what the required funding is from then until the expected purchase date. When we get to the purchase, to the date of the expenditure, whether it be a capital or the operating expense, the expenditure would come in front of this board. So just because we've reserved, for example, $500,000 for a new fire truck, at the time that the department wants to access those funds, they would come in front of the Board of Finance, present us with the anticipated capital project. We would review it like we review other projects, and then we would allow staff to move the amount that was accrued for that item into a separate capital account. Once moved into that capital account, then, try and correct me if I'm wrong, then the departments would have the control over it and be able to draw that down like any other capital account that we have. When that capital expenditure is done, if there's money left over, that money will immediately flush back into the Board of Finance Reserve Fund for capital non-recurring expenditures and be able to be used for other projects going forward.
One other thing, Jim, as in the annual quote, recalibration, if an account appears to be underfunded, we would determine whether this board should allocate more funds to go into that reserve account. If it's determined that it's overfunded, then we would determine whether it makes sense to pull funds back out of that account to make sure it's appropriately funded at each time.
Correct, and on the next page, we put together just a very simple example that outlines one of those situations. The top graph just showed, for a simple $500,000 item, we'd accrue it over 10 years, $50,000 per year. The bottom graph shows that if after year 4, the cost was revised downward 20%, well then at that point, since we could either, in this example, begin to accrue smaller amounts for the remaining 6 years, or as Dan pointed out, we could choose to take money out of the reserve and sort of level it over the remaining 6 years.
Couple of questions, just in terms of that particular example. $500,000 feels like something we would typically roll into a bond issue along with a lot of other stuff that's being done, say, in the year in which it's considered. 2 questions about that. Did you identify enough projects where there's sufficient visibility that a department head could say, yeah, I'm going to need to do that in 10 years and it's going to cost directionally this amount of money, and therefore it makes sense to start to reserve for it now? And then second, even if you did identify that project, do you have some criteria or some thinking as to why you'd actually want to start to treat projects of that nature like we do fire apparatus as opposed to sort of typically just what we've normally done, which is they pop up without as much sort of foresight, and we just bond them with other stuff when the time comes.
Well, the category that we focus on, if you remember, is just those things that we choose to continue to reserve for. So if we were going to bond for it, like we wouldn't, we typically haven't bonded, for example, for fire apparatus.
Right.
We paid sort of cash for that after having accrued it ahead of time. But to the extent that this board felt like it was appropriate to bond for something, then we just wouldn't reserve for it.
I think, as Jim said earlier, first of all, we've been trying to do a white paper, what's the right way to approach this? And with Jen's help, we've had to make sure that it kind of works for the town.
Yep.
We haven't yet taken these mechanics and examined each account in the
Right.
town to determine what effect it might have. So that's to your first point. To your second point, as I mentioned earlier, we have not yet evaluated the reserving versus bonding and try to come up with a consistent policy around that, if that makes sense for us to do at some point.
Okay.
So this is really, when is it appropriate to establish a reserve? We may choose to, rather than establish a reserve, bond something, but the purpose of this meeting so far has been to,
Yeah, I mean, I
With those
really
guys.
I really like all this stuff. I guess one other question as you advance your thinking on this is I'd be curious as to whether within the town's budget, or really, I guess, the whole town, including Board of Ed, is there spiky spending around expenditures of this nature, where you look at it and say, wow, because we really didn't plan for that, or we didn't have that sort of advanced thinking, you can look at our budget and our expenditures sort of period to period, and you see spikiness there, right, that affects taxpayers. It doesn't give them this kind of smooth expenditure over time that really is a driver behind why we bond a lot of these things, is to kind of smooth out the impact on taxpayers. I'm just kind of curious as if when you've looked at the budget, but maybe pulled out the projects that sort of fitted within the scope of what you're talking about, if over the last few years that you can point to and say, yeah, there's spikiness in there, and if we had this kind of reserve policy in there, it would smooth things out for taxpayers. No reason, not critical, I just mentioned that because that's been something we've highlighted several times in the past when we've talked about, for example, the smoothing of debt service and decisions around refundings to make sure that we stick with that policy. So anyway, just an
Yeah.
observation.
Well, one of the things what we did is, keep in mind the 2.4 million that we have in reserves currently, about 1.7 of that is fire apparatus.
Right.
So that's like the largest chunk of it. Other things do exist for certain equipment at Public Works and so forth, but what we've done here is we said to qualify for a major, it had to be more than 100,000, because we thought if it was more than 100,000, then it has the potential to add lumpiness to our annual budgeting cycle. There's, too many $100,000 things pop up, next thing you get $1 million worth of capital. So the idea is to try to get, I think, all the departments to start thinking more forward, beyond what they're doing currently with the fire apparatus and the police vehicle replacement cycle, but to think about, here's something I know we're going to need to replace in X years. This is something that we've been replacing every, 4 or 5 or 6 years for 20 years, rather than just waiting for that to pop up. Let's start to accrue for it.
Yep. Other questions? Francis?
And how does, from, the amounts here are probably too small to make a difference, but from a rating agency perspective, how are these reserve accounts, are they valuable to us in terms of ratings presentations?
Not really, it doesn't really come up. They would focus more on the general fund balance, and I guess where it could have an impact is when they look at our year-over-year budget growth. But our capital is a small portion of our overall budget, so it doesn't really have much impact.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether we'd be better off with the money in the,
Yeah.
In fund balance,
Yeah.
if you're gonna have it there, we would
Yeah.
at least get credit for
Yeah.
it. That's a great observation.
Yeah, these are encumbered funds, so we don't get to count them when they look at sort of our reserve ratio. And I think when we get to listen, we're talking about smoothing and reevaluating these large capital reserves each year to make sure that we don't have too much in there. We don't want to be accumulating more than we actually need. And what we saw was in this prior budget cycle, we basically, learned that we eliminated a $500,000 contribution to the fire apparatus reserve, and that still kept us on a trajectory that would meet our needs. And so I think what this is meant to do is, if each year they're reevaluating when we need it and how much it's going to cost, then we can ensure that we don't have excess sitting in there.
I think it was more about cleaning up the process than trying to reserve for more projects or eliminate lumpiness in the large projects. I felt like it was more driven from trying to clean up some of the smaller, more stagnant pools of capital that were being reserved for
Right.
things that,
Yeah.
Yeah, reduce the number of reserve accounts,
Right.
which serves all of those
So I would say,
objectives.
on the major capital expenditures, the two biggest changes as we talk about this are including major operating expenditures, like the revaluation,
Right.
and putting an annual review on the amount and sort of where we are in our accrual basis. That's like the biggest change around major capital. We're not recommending necessarily changing things that we accrue for, just making sure that it's always accurate, not too much, not too little, and that we're constantly reevaluating when we're going to need it. So the more, I think, moving to page 6, the other two areas that we focused on were, I mentioned there were 14 different capital reserves just throughout the town. And when we looked at those, these are reserves that we contribute anywhere from, Jen, I think $10,000 to $50,000 per year.
Usually around 10 to 20 for the small capital, the generic small capital.
Yeah. Which are meant to be used for kind of smaller items, right? But we've seen over the years, like those have been built up and then used for a little bit larger item, an item that might otherwise kind of pop up in our actual budget process, where we do more review on it and so forth. So what we're recommending on what we call the minor capital expenditures are that each year, if there's a minor capital expenditure that needs to take place, which is less than $100,000, that'll come across as part of the capital budget each year. And so if there has to be a new, lawnmower, that's commercial grade lawnmower, that's $20,000, right? That'll come through the normal budget process, and we'll place that $20,000 in an actual capital account with a name on it that says for this item. And when they come to purchase that item, they can then draw down on it for the entire $20,000 during that fiscal year. At the end of the fiscal year, if they haven't used, for example, the $20,000 for the commercial lawnmower, then if they've encumbered it and they've ordered it and it's just going to be coming 2 or 3 months from now, the money would remain in there and cover it. If they decided at the end that they don't need it, the money would come back into our reserve fund. Or if they decide that they just need to push it out another year, then it would sort of flow back into the general fund or into our capital fund and be reappropriated the next year.
I have a different understanding of that. My impression was that these minor ones would follow our usual closeout process, where at the
Sorry,
end of the
yeah,
year, if
yeah.
it's unexpended and they have justification to keep the appropriation open, then it would remain already appropriated for that purpose.
Correct, yeah. So if they haven't spent it and they're still going to spend it, then it'll remain in that reserve. If they're not going to spend it and they no longer need that specific item, then it needs to flow back through. They can't just use that $20,000 to then go buy a generator or something opposite.
Well, that's why there's a gate, right? So they can't spend it until we've had a chance to look at it to make sure it's consistent with the intent of the reserve.
But it's not a reserve,
Right, it is just a project account.
it's a project account.
Right.
Right, that hasn't been fully utilized. A
But
la the security system for the police department,
Right.
right?
And by the way, these would all be subject to the regular review that you do, right? For
Yes.
accounts where there's been no expenditure over some discrete period.
Right.
Okay.
So the money goes into the capital account and it stays in there we review it each year, and so long as they're going to spend it, it can stay in there, but if it's not going to be spent, it'll flow back through,
Right.
and it can't be used for anything else. So it's a specific use capital account. In addition to that, we recognize that, you know, these 6 departments, the 3 fire departments, the police department, and the Parks and Rec and Public Works, do have a need for some small capital reserve for small items that sort of pop up, that we don't necessarily want to create a capital account for, you know, some type of power tool or items that might cost $500 or $1,000. So what our recommendation is that for each of these 6 departments, we would create a capital account, which would be funded at the beginning of each budget with $5,000 to $10,000, similar to some of the other capital accounts that we're creating today. But at the end of the year, if that capital account is not used, whatever's left in that would be would kind of come back to the budget process, and the following year they'd get another $5,000 to $10,000. So rather than having these would effectively be non-lapsing capital accounts.
I thought we didn't like non-lapsing accounts, just kidding.
No, sorry, these would be
Lapsing.
these would be
Yeah, right, they lapse
lapsing
in-
You're
accounts.
right,
So
they
that's-
don't like
new-
non-lapsing.
All right, we still
These are
don't like
lapsings.
it, perfect.
Let's make sure we get that right.
The
then.
non-lapsing.
These would be lapsing accounts at the end of the year. If they did not use them for any small type of capital projects, they'd flow back into our reserve fund, and then the following year, we could use those monies to reappropriate it for the next year. So it's meant to be a sort of finite period, finite amount of capital for the small unknowns. So we have major capital, which is gonna be reserved for, if not bonded or appropriated. We have minor capital, which will just be appropriated into project accounts during each budget season. Then we have sort of a, you know, small contingency capital account, $5,000 to $10,000 for each department, that they can use just during that year. Whatever's not used expires, and it comes back through our budgeting process. And then the last one is, we would take our current reserve fund for capital non-recurring expenditures, and we would allocate 35,000 of that to a sort of town-wide capital account that could be used for unexpected items that pop up, whether it be an unexpected maintenance event or some new item that we need to pay for. And in that example, these are for very time-sensitive items. Something pops up, they have 2 days that they need to spend to fix something, and so it'd be a $35,000 account that the town could access. In order to access that for anything under $15,000, both Kate and the town department would come to both Kate and Jen, and they would approve it, and that money would free up and be able to be used by that department. If it was more than
These would just be for capital expenditure, small capital, not for
Yes,
repairs
small
or things that would come out of operating costs.
Correct, so again, all capital, so they could use that. If it was greater than $15,000, then you would need Jen and Kate to approve it, and then they would get the approval from the chair of the Board of Finance, because it's greater than $15,000. And because the account would be funded at $35,000, it can never exceed $35,000 without the approval of this whole board.
Got it.
And so the way that this would work is, if something was needed throughout the year, a $5,000 amount, they'd come to Jen and Kate, they could approve it. If it was 20, it would be Jen and Kate plus John. And then if we saw the balance in this account dwindling from 35 and got down to 5,000, then this board could then decide, well, we want to maybe, there's 4 months left in the year, we want to maybe replenish it with another $10,000, still subject to the rules of how it can be drawn down. So those are the 4 types of accounts: large capital, accrued for over the expenditure period; minor capital, appropriated each budget cycle, and it stays in that account until it's spent or determined that it's not needed; small capital accounts for each of the 6 departments of $5,000 to $10,000 for the small tools and unexpected things; and then a sort of consolidated town-wide $35,000 account that the Board of Finance would control, and that Jen and Kate, and depending on the size, John could allow access to. So so we've gone from having 14 different accounts to 6 accounts that are in the $5,000 to $10,000 range, and then just one $35,000 account here that underneath the Board of Finance.
I like it. Was all this fairly straightforward in terms of your deliberations? I know Jen was involved, Jack was involved. Are all of you in agreement that this makes good sense, or was there anything that was a more difficult aspect of this decision? Or is it really just figuring out how to get it done efficiently?
I think there was, you'll see in the presentation, you know, and Jack as chair of F&B was very involved in all, you know, we had, I think, 4 or 5 different Zoom calls and so forth. There was some discussion of whether each department, whether there should be 5 or 10,000 in terms of the capital reserve, and it might be different for some departments. And so I think, you know, that was a number that we thought we would figure out sort of as we roll it out through this budget process. I don't know, Jen, do you have anything to add in terms of like those amounts?
No, I think those are reasonable, especially given the $35,000 contingency account. So if we gave a fire department 5,000 and they needed to make a purchase and the 5,000 wasn't sufficient, we could authorize it from the contingency account. If it wasn't time sensitive, we could come back to the board and say, turns out 5 wasn't the right number, we need to have more, and we could request a transfer.
So the $5,000 to $10,000 amounts of the 6 different departments sort of plays in with the 35,000 that we would have here at the board. And I think there was a little bit of discussion around, you know, what level would we think it's appropriate for Jen and Kate to sort of seek this board's approval to go above. I think we kind of came at the $15,000 number, but we sort of recognized that it could be sort of an urgent, time-sensitive need. So that's kind of how we came up with the process by which, if it was over 15,000, John, they would have, you know, they would need the chair's approval, or if you were out of town, somebody that you might designate,
Right.
just to kind of give them some additional, you know, sort of elected sign off on larger amounts.
If all this gets approved, would you envision trying to implement this system for the 21-22 budget cycle?
Yeah, I think for the most part, we can convert most of our department requests. We're at the beginning of the budget process. I gave them the heads up today that we might be scheduling a call with all of them based on this discussion. But I think we're at a point where we're not too far into the budget. We can easily transition some of their requests into this format and move them away from the reserve thinking that they were using for some of the ones that we're eliminating.
And I think give them time to evaluate some of the larger items that are currently being reserved for what is the cost, when is the expected expenditure date, and so forth. And then I think, you know, at the end of that analysis, we may well see, as we get through the budget cycle, we may have too much reserve. And if that's the case, then that can be sort of withdrawn, put into our capital reserve account, and be used to fund some of the fiscal year 22 capital projects to alleviate pressure on the mill rate. But I think if we get this started during the budget cycle, we'll probably know sooner rather than later if we're over-reserved or under-reserved.
I like all this a lot. Tell us a little bit about next steps.
So, page 7, next steps. Page 7. So I think if the Board of Finance approves this,
Moving
then-
things along, baby.
If the Board of Finance approves this, then Kate and Jen would sort of have discussions with all the town departments, again, the fire departments, the police department, Parks and Rec, and Public Works, to discuss how this is being, you know, how to start implementing this as part of the upcoming budget cycle. You know, again, that would include a recalibration, like in the example of the fire trucks. You know, what is the expected cost, what is the expected replacement date, and looking at the existing reserves. And, you know, then we should know, I would guess, like into the February, kind of January, February timeframe, we'd start to have an idea if we're over or under reserves. I think another thing that we talked about is, you know, because we're trying to create one consistent approach for the entire town, you know, we should begin discussions with the Board of Ed, you know, as part of their budget, although it's not in their operating budget, the last, you know, 10 pages of their budget book include for each of the district buildings, priority 1 through 3, and generally going out for the next 5 years. They have sort of projects, you know, with some round numbers just as placeholders in there and so forth, and they generally move up the priority scale and you know, as we move throughout time, they end up coming as part of the capital budget. So I think one of the discussions worth having with the Board of Ed is, are there certain capital projects that you know for sure that fit into your overall sort of long-term facilities plan that, you know, you have a sort of fairly accurate expectation about how much it will be and when it will come. And if there's a, you know, HVAC system or boiler or a roof or something that we know needs to be overhauled, and that's a $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 project, then rather than waiting for that to just pop up in 4 years or 3 years, if that's a 10-year asset, we should start accruing for that like we do fire trucks and other things. Things that, you know, things that we decide that we're not going to bond, but we want to accrue. Again, all trying to smooth the overall expenditures so that there's not, you know, lumpiness doesn't create sort of pressure on mill rate.
As I said, I like this a lot. I think it's very thoughtful. It solves a gigantically serious problem, but one that's festered for a long time, just in terms of needing sharper oversight and sharper thinking, and I think these proposals absolutely do that. So really well done. I know you three have worked on it. Frank or Paul or Rob, do you guys have any questions? Francis?
My question is, if we were to implement this, Jen, what would you expect in the first year budget? Would there be a jump up in amounts would be?
I don't think there'll be a big jump up in amounts. I think the fire apparatus is gonna be interesting to look at because it hasn't been funded on a straight line basis. It's been 500, 550,
Yeah,
seems
that's
about the
my
right
point,
number. What can we afford this year, that kind of an approach. So that may, I don't know how much that will change when we look at their plan, their replacement schedule, and actually straight line it. For the most part, the other ones, the two major ones are park and rec equipment replacement and public works equipment replacement. The departments have kind of thought of that as, I need to buy a truck, so I'm gonna put that much into the reserve and take it out. So I don't think it'll change drastically in the amounts, but it will change in the way that we actually account for that. And instead of it going into a reserve, they'll be saying, I wanna buy a truck, and that truck will compete with all the other projects. So dollar-wise, I don't think a big impact, but I think the list of projects that you see come forward may grow. So it may seem overwhelming, like all of a sudden we're doing all this capital, but I think rather than being a one reserve contribution, it might be 2 or 3 individual project purchase requests.
And I think that
if we added the Board of Ed to this, though, it would jump it up.
Well, yeah, so we currently don't accrue for any Board of Ed projects. So if we were to bring them in, that, you know, that could add to it, but again, that could also prevent some of the lumpiness that we see. And again, this is for projects that we don't bond. So if there's a $3 or $4 million project coming forward to redo a roof, I mean, I think there was I think we approved like $300,000 or $400,000 for one of their larger projects for the design and development, and then the other one should be coming in a year or two. So that could cause it to jump up, and I think things like the revaluation, which we haven't accrued for before.
Well, reval's been on and off on whether we've accrued for it or not.
But the current one,
There's a little bit of a balance sitting there, so
Yeah.
we will have to accrue for the upcoming one. It won't be over 5 years, it'll be a little compressed.
Yeah, I think the amounts involved here, if you want to avoid lumpiness, they have to be large amounts, right? Because
Yeah.
the small amounts just get lost in there.
yeah, and that's why I think we set this accrual,
Yeah.
and it need to be at least $100,000. And I guess, you know, that's, you know, that can be changed over time if we see.
So
If
is
there
this-
was
so
some
it's-
science around any of the 5 to 10 or 35 or 100, it was really, I think the entire working group felt comfortable those numbers, making sure that those worked for the town based on Jen's guidance, but, I mean, those could be tweaked, absolutely.
Yeah, when we actually put this into practice, we may find that some of it just doesn't quite work right. But I'll certainly come back to you and let you know if something.
Yeah,
It's
I just
well
want to
thought.
avoid, if the issue is to avoid lumpiness, I don't want to create lumpiness.
Yeah.
I don't think
Right.
we will be creating.
Okay.
this.
Okay, great, thanks.
I mean,
Well,
if it was to require a large contribution, because all of a sudden we found that we were behind,
We can
we
manage.
could decide that we don't need to catch up in 1 year, we could catch up in 2. I think
Right.
the idea is to kind of plan for long-term,
Yeah, okay.
you know, smoothness. And I think just one thing to think about for this board, what we have suggested, like if we're accruing for a project over 10 years, when it gets to the 10th year, it's been reserved for, but it hasn't been put in a capital account. So on that 10th year, that project would come before the board, we would review it. Now, granted, we've been looking at it each year and so forth, but we would review it and then move those monies into a capital account at that point, at which it would then become the responsibility and under control of the department.
Great. So what do you need from the board this evening? General, an overall approval of the plan and next steps following approval?
Yeah, I think just a sense of the board that you're comfortable with this approach, and giving us the direction to begin implementing it for the next budget cycle.
Well, this works for me. I mean, I've had a chance to read through this pretty carefully, and of course, I've thought about these reserve accounts for a while. And as I said, this is a great cleanup of that and sharpens up how we approach that, I think, in a great way. And even if it requires some further tweaking as we go through implementation, the reality is we can do that, right? So this is, I think, a great way to get started on that path. And I'm certainly supportive. So maybe what we do is just take a quick sense of the board resolution on supporting this, and further to that, empowering Jen with her colleagues as well as the team that's been working on this to set implementation in motion. Does that make sense? Okay, could I get a motion for that? Jim is going to move that. Second? Dan and Taylor, both you guys can move it. All in favor? Terrific. Rob, you okay with this?
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks to the working team for a really great document. Thanks, Jim and team.
Yeah, I'd echo that, not just the document, but the process, the collaboration, Jack's involvement, working with Jen, fantastic, really just textbook. So,
Yeah, that's, yeah, big thanks to Jack, who I think,
yeah,
you know, had a lot of history around some of these accounts, I think, and helped us.
yeah, which is great. I mean, nobody does their homework like Jack Davis, so he knows that stuff cold. There's just no doubt about it, so I'm glad he was involved. That's terrific. Well, again, thank you. This is a tremendous effort, and I think it's going to be a valuable change over the long term. So, okay. Next up is discussion of budget guidance for next year. So what I did was I updated the slide that we had last year to try and reflect kind of three areas. First is what I would describe as core spending, which is existing personnel, existing operations, existing initiatives. Second would be new stuff, which could be headcount, capital investments, benefits changes, anything that would be incremental to what we have currently budgeted. And then finally, anything that has to do with the current pandemic and how to plan for those expenditures. So in terms of guidance for each of those three areas, what I'd come up with was that the core spending really should not increase more than 2.5%, and that we should maintain a flat head count. So in that case, the 2.5% was meant to take into account union pay increases, inflation, that sort of thing. I would point out, though, that town departments actually have been able to come in at significantly less than that. So maybe my guidance, in fact, is not strict or strong enough, so I would take input from everybody. In terms of new spending, making a clear and compelling case is the guidance. And so what we would expect is departments to come in, meet the budget guidance that we've set out for core operations. And if they have something that's beyond that, that's driven by new initiatives, is to simply make the case for that and explain not only what it is, but why they need it, and importantly, why they need it now. And then finally, in terms of COVID, it's hard to say exactly, in my mind, sort of what guidance we would provide that's quantitative. I think my guidance, as I was thinking of it, was more qualitative in nature, which is to say, look, you got to do what's required. We got to keep people safe, both for the town and for the schools and the children that we educate. I think they should be budgeted separately, because I like to shine a spotlight on those expenditures. I think that's important because it allows us to think about them not only for an individual department, but if there is some way, as we're looking at all those expenditures, to combine oversight somehow or coordinate a little bit better, we might actually get more bang for our buck. And then finally, budgeting them separately allows us not just to focus on expenditures, but also things like avoided costs, right? What are we not spending money on because of the pandemic? And then what about revenue? Can we be clear about that as well? I think further to this, we might work with the town and the Board of Education staff to say, for everybody who's going to be budgeting for COVID, can we provide some guidance in terms of what we're looking for? And then one other point I wanted to make was that I think this is also an area where we really ought to have benchmarks. Everybody's trying to feel their way forward on this, and so to the extent that we can have visibility into what other towns are doing, both in terms of their COVID expenditures, but also how they're planning for them for next year and how they're thinking about that. Not that we'd have to adopt everything they come up with, but it would be good to just know that from a benchmarking standpoint. So layering on top of that, not just for COVID, but for everything else, keeping stakeholders informed, the public, Board of Finance, RTM, the more iterations around this that we can have as part of the budget process, the smoother the approval at the end of the process will be. And that's something that's certainly been true for a long time, and we'd want to repeat that. So that's kind of what I had in mind for this guidance. I know, Jim, you sent me some content or some perspectives on that, which I didn't get to read until just now, which was valuable, but to the extent anybody has any, I'd like to hear it. And if we can come to an agreement on that, what we'll do is we'll issue that guidance after this meeting, get that out to the respective boards, and then I'll highlight it in the State of the Town address. Comments? Jim, you had some comments? Why don't you
I would
start?
just say, the one comment I had on, in terms of new initiatives and so forth, I think your point about making it like a clear and compelling case is a good one. I think we should also make sure that it's a compelling case for the timing, to the extent that we see that whether it be in the Board of Selectmen or Board of Ed side, that this is kind of continuing. We should evaluate, is it the best time to implement that a new initiative?
Yep. Great comment. Others?
Yeah, question is, does anyone have a sense of what the blended annual increase in salaries across both the town and the schools? Is that in the 2.5% to 3% range
It was
on a blended basis?
It's a good point. That 2.5% number was envisioned to capture all of that. My guess is that it's probably at least that, I would say. So if that's true, then that suggests efficiency in other areas so that you can meet that overall target.
Right. Okay.
Jennifer, do you have a thought on that?
On the town side, our contracts, the gross wage increases are less than 2.5%, so that does allow room for step increases as well. And then also probably some additional room for inflation.
I think on the Board of Ed side, the recent administrative contract was 2%. And which is about a tenth the size of the teacher's contract, and the teacher's contract without assuming the step, like the turnover and so forth, which, including step, but not including turnover, probably puts it in this sort of, 2.5%, to maybe 2 3/4.
All right, so the 2.5% guidance is not unreasonable based on what I'm hearing.
That's kind of what I was getting at.
Okay. Other comments? Taylor, you're scowling. Means you got something smart to say.
No, I was remembering that number being higher for teachers. There was like 3+.
Well, but see, that's an interesting point, because remember, there was the headline for the contract, but because of tenure mix and steps and all that, right, the bottom line number in terms of dollars out the door versus dollars out the door prior to the contract was a non-trivial amount higher than what the headline number was in terms of percentage increase.
And I think it's also, it's, as you said, like existing personnel, is also like, student body size, where that shakes out. I think we saw this year, there were a few, absent COVID, there were a few less sections than expected.
Yep. Frank or Paul or Rob, comments?
Well, I just, if you look at corporate America on the COVID front, a lot of what they're trying to do in focusing on solving for COVID has a forward-looking aspect. So, in other words, they're looking to make changes to deal with the current situation, which changes should have favorable impact later. So, I'm not suggesting you change this at all. I think this is great. But when you're looking at the COVID expenditures, if if you can go this way or that way, and this way has some benefit as an experiment or as a, a test, might have operating benefit, we should be kind of we should go that direction, even if it's possibly a little more expensive.
Right, one thing that we're finding is the need to have more services available online.
Yeah,
We have
exactly.
definitely been lagging in that, so there may be some investment needed
Yeah.
in order to move
Yeah.
services online. and make it
That's my point.
really work.
That's an excellent point. I mean, a lot of the COVID spending, when you kind of read about it, has this reactive feel to it, like, oh my God, we got to go buy masks, and we got to put in hand sanitizer, and we got to hire people to help, and it's all kind of reactive. But to your point, and I see this as well, even in my own company, there's a lot of sort of perspective looking forward to say, okay, well, if this is sort of a new reality, even if we get a vaccine, the fact is that people are a lot more comfortable with not traveling and with Zooming and with work from home and a lot of other things that we never would have considered before, and therefore we should be thinking a little bit differently on certain things, like how much commercial real estate we need and what types of IT and conferencing equipment we have to have, that type of thing. That's actually good. I want to make that as a separate point here, which is be reactive in the moment to make sure you're keeping everybody safe, but also make sure you keep a long-term hat on and say, what can we do to start now to think about how this might permanently change things. I think that's great. Other comments? All right, well, if you have anything else, do email me. I've got Jim's email. What I'll try to do is get this straightened out no later than the weekend, and then I'll send this single page to the board chair, to the first selectman and the chairman of the Board of Ed, just so they have that for their respective boards. And as I said, I'll reemphasize it as part of my State of the Town address. But thank you, that's great. Second, next up is discussion of the 5-year forecast. So what I handed out, and Rob, I'll send this to you. You've seen it before. It's taken a while, but Jennifer and I have worked up this, what I would call master spreadsheet of data, where she has gone through and pulled statistical and financial data into a single sheet, and allows you to look at it over an extended period of time. So if you take a look at what I passed out, and I'll just describe it for you, Rob, there's nothing to vote on, it's really just kind of an FYI. It starts off with stats around population and staff levels, both for the town and Board of Education, and then breaks it out on a P&L basis, kind of right down to the bottom, and then finally around fund balance and debt, which are the two key parts of our balance sheet that we report on. So in this kind of single file, you really do get at a high level all of the major expenditures by category that are relevant to looking at a longer term forecast. But importantly, without getting into so much detail that it starts to get to be too much to really guess as to how things might turn out. So as you can see here, this has what I think is sufficient line item detail in order to come up with a look ahead view of sort of 5 years. But it's also got enough historic data where we could come in and extrapolate trends by type of expenditure. So when I've done these 5-year forecasts in the past, that's really how this starts, which is with this data file, and then a combination look back in terms of historic trends in this data, and then a look forward based on that trend, plus what we're seeing today that might cause a deviation in that trend. And so my intention was to sort of take the same approach this time. The way Jennifer puts this together, I find it's pretty helpful, and the way it's set up, it also allows me to link into a chart that I can show when I give my presentation. So that's the core of all this. There are a few other slides and some other data that we look at depending on what analyses might come out of this. One of the things we talked about last time is, given the changed format for the State of the Town, I'm going to shorten my presentation pretty dramatically, kind of half what it has been historically, just because I don't think we need to go into all that detail, and the format doesn't work as well for extended remarks. So I'll try to focus on the core issues as part of that presentation. My plan is Jennifer needs a little bit more time to finish updating the sheet, but over the next couple of weeks, I'll get that translated into a document that should be ready to go, a week or several days at least before the State of the Town address, and I'll circulate that to this group and try to get your final input and then go and give that speech. So that's where we are. Questions?
When is the date of the state?
December 7th.
I hope it doesn't live in infamy.
I try not to make these things live in infamy, but you just never know. I have gotten in trouble before, so don't put it past me. Other questions, comments? Okay, excellent, thank you. All right, Jennifer, financial report.
I feel like it's always kind of boring. On the revenue side, if you look at the page 1 of the report, town clerk, right in the center of your page, they have collected 74% of their budget as of October 31st. They have experienced a very high volume of real estate transactions and mortgage refinancings. I'm not sure how much longer that is going to continue, but we did reduce the budget a little bit, fearing that COVID might have a negative impact on them, and we were wrong. And then also building permits, we had a department head meeting this morning, and from what P&Z and building and the fire marshal are saying, they're starting to see activity from the redevelopment projects, pulling permits for their demolition and initial phases, so we should start to see some revenue coming in from those projects for building permits. We budgeted about $750,000 for that. On the expenditure side, there's really nothing of interest. The departments are tracking where we would expect them to for this time of year, and I don't foresee any problems on the expenditure side at this time.
The only thing that I thought of while looking through all this is the potential value in having a little bit more of a detailed COVID report, just to try to take a look at that. I know that's probably simpler to produce on the town side than it is the Board of Ed side. I'll call you about that.
Okay.
Because we had a discussion with with sort of the board chairs before, but not something that had kind of any detail or nuance about how we're thinking about this, both in terms of expenditure as well as revenue loss and avoided costs. And maybe you and I could just have a conversation about that in terms of how you're collecting data, and if there's something that's being done that would yield some interesting insights that we could take a look at. But also just looking ahead, especially before we get into the budget process, should we be making any changes in how we're doing budgeting to get people to think more carefully about what they might need to spend that's COVID related going forward, both so that we can know about it with more clarity, but also give some thought to how, if anything, what if anything could be done to better manage it. So, but I'll give you a call, we can talk about that and
Okay.
maybe highlight that at the next meeting. So, questions for Jennifer about the financial report?
You said that the building permit revenue was expected to come in as planned?
I'm not sure if we're gonna hit budget, but we are gonna start seeing some of that redevelopment money. The $750,000 was half of the estimated permit revenue from the 3 projects. But because they collect the permit revenue in phases, it really depends on the timing of the projects.
My only other question is just on some of the grants. It looks like those are on track in the sense of when we get paid for those. Do you have any concerns emerging about any of the state grants that we've received that you know about?
No, no concerns on those at the moment.
Okay. Other questions for Jennifer?
No real pickup in the pay and the parking fees?
A little bit. Ticket revenue is picking up a little bit. We began ticketing in September. So September and now October, we're gonna have a little bit more activity. The daily parking has picked up a little bit, but it's not significant. So even if life were to return to normal next month, that fund is gonna have a problem.
And the permits have been delayed till March?
That was the plan. I don't know if it's official. You get a permit, you probably know better than I do on that.
I haven't seen anything in the mail.
No, I think that's right.
I think
I think that's right.
I know Board of Selectmen
don't
was
have
supposed to
to.
discuss it. I don't know if it's.
No, I think I got
I
a
think so.
notice.
Yeah.
It's officially extended.
Yeah.
Chances of me giving up my parking pass? 0. It took 7 years to get
Are
it.
they gonna increase the cost for the other 9 months by 25% or 33%, whatever it is?
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah, so that fund took a hit last year. It can handle taking a hit again this year, but if we were to go beyond that, we would really have a problem with our parking lot.
Okay. Terrific. If no other questions on that, minutes. I had a chance to read through the minutes. These are the ones for, where's my first page? These are the ones for last month, October 20th. Here it is. Any comments or corrections to the minutes? Thanks again to Dan for doing this.
I can't be here and absent at the same time.
Excellent. So which was it?
Split personality.
I believe you were absent that day.
Yes, I was
That was a
absent.
great catch. Okay, motion to approve the minutes as edited. Francis? Second? Taylor? All in favor? You okay with the minutes there, Rob?
Abstain.
All good.
Great, okay. All right, next up is committee assignments. So we have sort of three, if you will, that we have staffed in the past. We have an audit committee, and Jennifer, you can remind us who is on those committees today. We've got shared services, which has basically been led by Frank, and then Dan is on the Oxbridge Building Committee. We had the Pear Tree Point Committee that Diana McGuire had worked on. I think, Frank, you'd picked that up as well, but that's sort of in stasis now while I guess we'll pick that up again someday in the future, but no activity on that at the moment as far as I understand. So really, this is just about audit, shared services, and Ox Ridge, and just seeing if everybody wants to continue in their current roles. Remind us who's on the audit committee, Jennifer?
Rob, Jim, and Taylor.
Rob, Jim, and Taylor. Okay, and then.
Good with staying on.
Okay, so Jim, Taylor, you guys okay with continuing for audit this year? Okay, and Frank for shared services, it kind of moves along, doesn't it? And then Dan, you're okay with the building committee for Oxbridge?
Yes.
Okay, I can't think of any changes to any of that unless anyone has suggestions.
John, I think the only union contract we have open is the Public Works right now. So, are there any others coming down the line?
I think Town Hall expires June 30th, 2021.
When do the,
We
pro-
have them staggered each year now.
when do the
so-
processes for those two contracts start?
Public Works is in process right now. It's been slow going because it's had to be virtual and we've had to cancel meetings here and there. But it's not a complicated contract, so I don't think it'll take us too many sessions to
Okay.
wrap that up. And then I believe Town Hall is next. They're also not terribly complicated, so if they're June 30th, 2021, we would want to start negotiations in the spring,
Okay,
and then the police would be the following year.
okay. All right, anything else on committees? Great. Speaking of committees, does anyone have any reports from any of the committees that they'd like to mention?
Yes.
Okay, Dan, go.
Yeah, Oxbridge, I'm going to just simply echo what Kip's remarks at the Board of Selectmen meeting last night. 26 bids were received, totaling $43.3 million, which is 12.9% below budget. 11 of the 26 bid packages have been awarded, and even, which is representing 33 of the 43 million, 33 million of the 43 million. So that's great. And scope reviews are ongoing on the remaining 15 bid packages. We expect to break ground in late November, and just a reminder that there's a parents' meeting tomorrow evening.
Okay.
And can I ask, how are we trending 12% under budget on that? I mean, what is that, $5 million roughly?
Yeah, a little bit. Well, first of all, it's 12.9% below what was budgeted for the construction aspect of it. And they, basically, the estimates were slightly north of what the project had been budgeted. You may recall, either at the last Board of Finance meeting or 2 meetings ago, I reported that we were about over $1 million north of our budget, but that the committee did not seem to be all that concerned about it because A, there were contingencies built into the budget, And B, we are getting guidance from our consultants that their recent experience with contractors and vendors was they were getting bids that were anywhere from 10 to 15% below what they were comfortable budgeting. And that is indeed what occurred. So that's as best I have for you.
Okay?
Super, thanks.
Just not to spend additional money, but if it looks like it's gonna come under that much, is there any appetite or discussion on the committee to go back and recheck the scope of the building and say, if we've set aside something in terms of capacity or features of that building in an attempt to get the budget down, because you recall we were $7-8 million over the $63 million that was appropriated, and so a lot of this was sort of scaled back, materials were changed, that sort of thing. Well, it looks like it's going to be several $1 million under what's been appropriated. Has there been any discussion on the committee to maybe revisit some of the things that were taken out that people didn't want to take out?
So there was a meeting yesterday, which I lost power, so I was not part of. So I'm not aware of any conversation about that. There may have been yesterday, but I wasn't aware of it. I'm not aware of it. So.
Okay.
But I'll bring that up.
Yeah, I mean,
That's a good point.
again, I don't want to waste money, and
If
it's
we
great
were-
to
yeah,
say,
if we
but
if we took this material and turned it to this material, which is adequate but less quality, can we flip that back?
yeah, and
with
then,
the-
yeah, and
with the money we've got.
the other one that I would mention is just that one of the spirits behind this particular project is to not repeat some of the issues we had with Tokenique and the high school, which was scope was taken out of those projects, and not that many years later, this board is approving money to upgrade those damn buildings. We cannot have that, right, with Ox Ridge. What we want to have is a smartly designed building, but one that really takes into account all the different things regarding scope to future-proof that building in terms of capacity, right? So making it easy to be upgraded in terms of capacity in the future, should that come about, or just making sure we build in as much capacity as financially prudent to do so. And so if we're gonna in fact save as much money as we're talking about here, to just ask that question again, did we set aside anything in terms of scope of that building that now, because of these bids, we might have an opportunity to revisit?
Yep.
So, okay. Any other updates? All good? Okay.
Just a question on
Sure.
Oxford, like, in terms of breaking ground in November, is the pay, like, do we think we need to contemplate another bonding at any time soon? Like, when do we think we'll use the funds that we've raised so far?
Well, now that they have bids in, we can take another look at cash flow.
Yeah.
But they haven't used too much of what we've already bonded.
It's only like $2 million. They've got $20 million in bonded proceeds that are not spent, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Okay. And the only thing I would say in terms of committee reports on the, I mentioned it when we were talking about the budget guidance, the administrator settled for 222 for each of the next 3 years. And that was after our last meeting before this one, so.
Okay, and that contract is now going to go to the RTM, or?
It'll likely go in front of the RTM. They'll probably stage it so the RTM votes on it in either January or February.
Okay,
Just because once they file it with the town clerk, then that's 30 days by which they have to vote on it.
got it,
Or not vote on it, but.
okay. All right, no other committee reports, chairman's report. For me, I just wanted to highlight what I forwarded around today, which is the investment portfolio report from Joan Henriksen, our treasurer. And she's gotten into a good rhythm of supplying us on a monthly basis so that we can take a look at sort of how the cash is invested. I remind everybody that those investment decisions remain her purview. Where our role kind of picks up is thinking about how you budget investment income and how she's planning and thinking about that. So I think this is a terrific report. I just wanted to make sure that everybody was getting them, and which I'll forward when I do get them myself. And hopefully this gives us some background that will build over time, so when we get to the point to consider the budget that she'll have for investment income, that we're informed by her monthly report. So I just encourage everybody to take a good look at this. If you've got questions, we can either discuss them here or you're welcome to contact Joan directly and just ask her. So, but I think this is terrific. Any questions about that? Okay, I think that's all I had this evening. I don't have anything else for my chairman's report. Does anyone else have any other business that we need to bring up? Seeing none, may I have a motion to adjourn? Okay, Dan, second, Paul, all in favor? Aye. Rob, you ready to adjourn?
I'm good.
He's good. We stand adjourned. Thanks, friends. Happy.